here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. World Environment Day is around the corner. This year, the theme, Ecosystem Restoration, is set to kick off a decade of initiatives to breathe new life into natural habitats, covering billions of hectares. As the world's biggest investor in renewable energy sources, China has made environmental protection a priority and has been walking the talk on its carbon neutrality pledge. That's a commitment to peak emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Chinese President Xi Jinping has reaffirmed China's commitment to climate actions at the Leaders' Summit in April. All eyes are now on the UN Biodiversity Conference, also known as COP15, set to take place in the Chinese city of Kunming in October. So what's next for China's efforts against climate change and biodiversity losses and that of the world? Ask that question to my panelists. For the World Environment Day in D.C., Wu Changhua, Executive Director of Professional Association for China's Environment. In Boston, Michael Melling, Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Welcome to both of you. Environment Day, certainly a big one every year. This year, very different because political momentum seems to be there. Ms. Wu.
Absolutely. This year, of course, the focus is around ecosystem restoration. Of course, on one side, we do need to protect biodiversity. On the other side, I think, biodiversity or conservation has very strong linkage with actions responding to climate change issues there. So the moment is critical, and you started to see all the dots are connected. Through the ecosystems, nature, carbon, water, everything actually, in order to deliver, the sustainable development goals we said we're going to do.
Mr. Melling, are the dots really connected?
Everything suggests that we're finally beginning to realize the seriousness of the challenges for the global environment, and we're beginning to act. But at the same time, and I think Ms. Wu would agree, we're developing, we're growing, we're extracting more resources, we're using more energy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's really this sort of generational race between essentially making our continued expansion, growth, more amenities and so on, more sustainable. Which of those two sides wins is really hard to anticipate. But I'm getting more optimistic than I was a few years ago.
UN Environment Program, together with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Program, put out a recent report. And they talk about how much in terms of eco building there needs to be in order to restore the damage. As much as 1 billion hectares of land by 2030 will has to be reforested in order to make sure the damage will be made up to. Is it too much to ask, Ms. Melling?
It is certainly daunting. There's no question about that. And I think it's fair to often wonder, can we achieve that? And don't forget that at the same time as we set ourselves the goals to do these transformations, to do these unprecedented sort of changes, we still continue seeing continued deforestation, for instance, in tropical rainforests, and degradation of land all around the world in many places. So it will be very challenging. But then again, it adds up. Every single project, every single initiative, it's the collective effort of millions, billions of people pushing here that ultimately is the only hope that it adds up and that we get where we have to be.
Ms. Wu, how about biodiversity?
Well, biodiversity has been declining since the 1970s, and 68% of the world, actually, totally the planetary, plants and animals species have disappeared. Mammals, invertebrates, fish. So the consequences, I think, for a human, we're feeling it, right?
Mr. Melling, we do see sporadic successful cases. For example, the endangered species such as the giant panda, which we all love. By the way, I made a trip recently to Chengdu and celebrated all the great pandas with everybody else. It's crowds over there. People certainly love the animal, not just because they're cute, but they're part of us. I mean, us, all the living creatures on the earth. But, from endangered species to not necessarily so anymore. Of course, human beings trying to experiment with how much we could help and eventually to provide them with a solution to go back to nature. Will examples like this really work on a bigger scale?
There's different ways to answer that question. My take is sort of both the glass half full and glass half empty. I think there have been really encouraging, good success stories when it comes to species conservation. Ensuring the recovery of species that were on the brink of extinction. They tend to often be those that are very iconic, like the panda, like certain large-scale fauna in North America as well. The bald eagle is a good example, which was very under a lot of pressure from pesticide use 30, 40 years ago and has made a good recovery. The wolf in Europe, for instance. So those are very visible examples. But at the same time, I think what Ms. Wu was alluding to before is that sort of behind the scenes, there's hundreds of thousands of species that are at the brink of extinction and vast areas, vast habitats that are being lost at the same time as we have these sort of isolated success stories. So I fear that, they may be kind of concealing some much more concerning, greater trends, even though we have pockets of success.
Right. Let's move on to the climate change issue. Seems to be a lot of political momentum already. Even China and the United States decided to work together under current geopolitics. It's a rare thing. But Mr. Melling, a lot of goals, no clear roadmap yet.
Yes, that's, I think, probably the biggest question when it comes to whether or not we will be able to tackle the climate challenge.
Yes.
I think in the very short term, it's really important to focus on the near and medium term goals as well. There's been this sort of trend to promise net zero emissions by 2050, but that's a long time into the future. So we need to think about 2030, even 2025, and what we need to set in motion in order to remain on a pathway to those long-term net zero emissions targets. One big piece of that is helping develop the technologies that are needed to continue, achieving development, continue providing access to electricity, to energy, etc. around the world, but at competitive cost and sustainably.
Ms. Wu, China also have claimed 2030, 2060 goals. It is all well known. So how much do you see roadmap is being drawn from this side of the world?
A couple of ways of looking at that. Don't really be fooled by numbers, particularly in terms of financial commitments.
Yes.
If you look at the $6 trillion you mentioned, actually in the US, the number has been, dwindling literally. And because the political debate and within the US between the two parties, so President Biden's infrastructure bill is now moving, from the $2.3 trillion now down to $1 trillion, still on the table. We don't know whether that's going to get through. So that's on the US side, we'll see. On China's side, I really applaud the commitment and, as the world's largest developing countries to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And for China, particularly immediate term, I think addressing coal issues, fossil fuel issues, that's a clear priority. In the meantime, also looking into the capping of oil, right? I think natural gas will continue to be part of the picture as a transition towards a more cleaner energy future. Yeah. So for China, first thing first, I think the end of the fossil fuel civilization is going to happen this decade. I think that's going to be the biggest transition for China and also China's biggest contribution to global civilization.
At this point, Mr. Melling, China's perspective seems to be linking many of the factors together so there will be a system being built. How do you see the development from China-US side, and what are the other players' role likely to be in this regard?
While we see sort of continued plans to expand or to continue using coal, for instance, many of these targets and policies actually should require that coal be completely stopped in the very near term, if not already now. The same applies in North America and Europe. So we have sort of these targets that would suggest do not invest in long-lived generation assets and other infrastructure that would, under normal circumstances, be expected to continue emitting for 3 or 4 decades if they have their normal economic life, their normal useful economic life. And yet we see those investments happening. So that, I think, is another important priority.
A lot to cover for such a short discussion. Thank you so much for both of you, and let's celebrate the Environment Day to make sure we still understand very well the road ahead. Thank you. Michael Melling, Wu Changhua, appreciate it. Thanks.